During the live feed, Ryan Pearson asks, what do you think of the action figures that are made to look like the ones from the 70s? They're in retro bubble packs and everything. That's a great question. And my short answer is, I like them. So long as they are new, not necessarily exactly the same as the figures that we had before. An example of a new retro style figure that I like, Grand Moff Tarkin, because we didn't have a Grand Moff Tarkin back in the day. So it was nice to see a Grand Moff Tarkin in the retro style, as they call it, to be able to not necessarily place alongside my vintage figures, but a figure that was designed like it would fit in that type of collection. I don't necessarily like these retro figures. And what I mean by that is that, well, let me go ahead and show you. On this side, it's a figure that's new. On this side, it's a figure that's definitely not new. Which is more valuable? Well, it could be argued that this one is, right? Because it is old or older, original. And despite its imperfect condition, it's still original. This one, however, is just as much fun. Like this Darth Vader figure, if it was open, and I do have one of these that's open. Of course, I have many of these that are open. But they're the same. Like, you couldn't tell me the difference between the two. I'm sure there are some people who could, but most people couldn't tell you the difference between a modern retro and a vintage figure. I mean, on card for sure, but loose? Like, I don't know. In terms of enjoyment, they're the same. You can't tell me that you would enjoy an original or vintage Darth Vader figure more than a retro style Darth Vader figure. I can't see it, apart from knowing that you've collected, a vintage figure over a modern figure. So that's the thing that kind of bugs me about the retro collection. Like, I feel like they didn't need to remake these because I feel that there were plenty of these still available. And I don't think that the retro collection has necessarily watered down the value of the vintage collection. If anything, it probably made them worth even more. It just makes it very difficult to collect vintage items because so many modern things are available. And the word that every collector hates to hear, repro. That's another snag that you can run into when you start redoing the classics. So I like the idea a lot. In many ways, I like the execution a lot of the retro collection. Even with this gigantic sticker, which a lot of collectors don't like, it doesn't bother me. I enjoy this. Maybe not the same way that I enjoy a vintage figure. I would encourage Kenner, Hasbro, to do more of these, but less of these. More unique characters we never got, more unique figures we never got, fewer figures that we already had or already have. Ultimately, I'm just happy that they are still producing Star Wars figures because I was there during the dark times when we had no new Star Wars figures. That was a very sad time in my life, though it gave me an opportunity to collect other things that I wasn't as interested in, but I was still happy to have new toys in my life. I just wished they were Star Wars figures. This actually leads me to another topic of discussion that's ancillary. Do you only collect vintage figures? Do you collect vintage and modern? Do you only collect modern figures? Like, to me, there's a clear delineation of vintage versus modern, though I guess this is up for debate because I've seen several modern figures, Power of the Force figures and beyond, listed as vintage. But to me, like, the original line from Kenner, where it stopped at the last 17, that is vintage. That is the line of vintage. Everything beyond that is modern. Are you just vintage? Are you just modern? Are you both? I'm both. Like, I'm happy that we have Star Wars figures, new Star Wars figures. Give me more Star Wars figures, specifically in the 3.75-inch scale, the classic scale, because that's what I grew up with. That's what I know. I hope they continue to produce them. Currently, they're calling it the Vintage Collection, though this wave of retro may also continue. And when I say wave, I don't just mean the wave of the figure I just highlighted, the Darth Vader figure. This is the Tarkin figure. The wave, like this oncoming wave of Star Wars newness That reminds us of the Star Wars oldness. That was me saying reminds us that I tripped over, right? Can you tell the difference? Not just in play, but is it just Star Wars to you? Are these just Star Wars figures? At that point, who cares if they're vintage or modern or retro or whatever? They are Star Wars. This is one of the reasons I love thrifting Star Wars figures as much as I do. And yes, I watch the various groups and communities to see what's on sale. When people are liquidating their collections, I often find things going to thrift stores. I'll find the Star Wars figures packed in baggies at a super affordable price. I typically will adopt the figures unless they're in really bad condition. I will often throw them together, all the modern figures together. I do have a separate vintage figures bin. Now, granted, that is secondary to my primary vintage Star Wars figure collection, which is complete, loose, with accessories, C9 condition or higher, which isn't much higher, C9 or C10 condition. That was something I went back and did a few years ago after having had most of the full vintage Star Wars figure collection when I was growing up, minus Yak Face, which I didn't even realize existed until I was a grown-up, and the internet came along and said, hey, Yak Face was a vintage figure. I'm like, what? I'll have to do a story about Yak Face at some point in the future. I'll have to get Yak Face on. Anyway, modern versus vintage, retro versus vintage versus modern. Where is this for you? Is it a thing for you? Had you even thought about it until now? This is apparently a subject of great debate in the Star Wars collecting community. Some people are just staunchly opposed to anything that's not vintage. And then there's the debate of where vintage starts. I've gone on record. I'm very, very happy that we have what we have today, and I would encourage the entire industry to keep giving us more. Not that I can get everything, because as much as I could be a completist with the vintage collection, or possibly with new releases, I can't be a completist with figures anymore. I definitely missed an era of time between the Phantom Menace and, I would say, probably The Force Awakens / Rebels time frame. That's where it was just in between for me. So I'm always happy to backfill, always happy to see new stuff, always happy to see them experimenting with retro lines, always happy to find vintage figures, always happy to see them together, happy to see you, happy to talk about Star Wars figures. What other topics? Are there any other topics apart from Star Wars figures? I could go on and on about this guy. Moman Adon, a.k.a. Hammerhead as we knew him back in the day. An Ithorian, one of the last vintage figures, if not the last vintage figure I needed to complete my collection back in the day, before I knew that Yak Face existed. I was happy to have it. So happy to have this one. I'm getting lightheaded, so I'm going to wrap this up. Do you love talking about Star Wars figures as much as I do? Do you love collecting them too? Great, we'll get along swimmingly, even if we don't swim. May the Force be with you, always. Unless we're swimming in Star Wars figures.